Jake Mann's world was a mess. Not just any mess, but a technological wasteland where the lines between man and machine were blurring faster than he could catch his breath. The city hummed with the constant hum of drones overhead and neon lights flashing like forgotten dreams. He used to be an engineer, a good one, until life and bad decisions led him into a dead-end job fixing broken tech at a warehouse that smelled like oil, metal, and sweat. At least it was a job, but now, he wasn't sure if he even had that anymore. He was a volunteer, no, a victim, for an upgrade. He had accepted the offer for a better life, a life where his skills were enhanced, where the world would be faster and more efficient. They said it would help him. They said he needed it. Everyone needed it. And it seemed harmless at first. After all, how bad could a routine neural procedure be? Jake snorted under his breath as he sat strapped into a cold metal chair inside the facility. His stomach churned, but he tried to calm himself. "It's just a tune-up," he muttered, mostly to himself. "A little tweak here and there. What's the worst that could happen?" The words were still hanging in the air when the door opened and in walked Dr. Prentice, the project leader. He was a tall man with a cold, calculating smile that never reached his eyes. He had been the one to sell Jake on the upgrade, the one who had promised that this would be the thing that would get him out of his rut. "Ready, Mr. Mann?" Dr. Prentice asked, his voice smooth but unnerving. "Yeah," Jake said, swallowing dryly. "Let's do this." The procedure room was silent, save for the whirring of machines and the rhythmic beep of medical monitors. Dr. Prentice had explained the process to Jake multiple times, but he was too nervous to care about the details. All he knew was that this upgrade would enhance his cognitive functions and physical strength, something the world was increasingly demanding. It sounded good on paper. It sounded too good to pass up. They inserted the needle into his arm, and Jake's body went numb almost instantly, but it wasn't the kind of numbness he'd expected. It wasn't just a physical numbness. His mind felt like it was shrinking, as if his thoughts were being boxed in by invisible walls. "Relax, Jake," Dr. Prentice's voice echoed through the room as Jake's vision began to blur. "You're doing fine." And then, the machines started. They weren't gentle. They weren't comforting. It was more like a relentless tide, pulling him under with no regard for what was left behind. His body was transformed piece by piece, organ by organ, muscle fiber by muscle fiber. His veins felt like they were replaced with wiring. His skin began to tingle as mechanical parts clicked and whirred beneath the surface. He wanted to scream. He wanted to fight it, but his mind felt too far away, too small. Jake woke up in a sterile, white room. For a moment, everything was foggy. His vision blurred and refocused, his eyes adjusting to the bright lights above. He groaned, trying to move his arms, but they felt heavy. Not in a way that muscle fatigue would feel, but like there was something else inside him. Something foreign. It took him a moment to realize that he wasn't in his own bed. He wasn't at home. He was in a facility, and something had gone wrong. He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through his skull, and he fell back against the pillow. Panic surged through him as he reached up to touch his face. His fingers brushed against smooth metal. His heart skipped a beat. No. No, no, no. His thoughts raced, disjointed and fragmented. His mind was flooded with strange sensations. It was as if his body wasn't his anymore. It was more machine than man. He had no idea how long he'd been out or how far the procedure had gone. "Jake," a voice said, breaking through his thoughts. It was Dr. Prentice again, standing by the door. His expression was unreadable, but Jake could see the faintest glimmer of something like satisfaction in his eyes. "How do you feel?" Dr. Prentice asked, a hint of smugness lacing his tone. Jake tried to speak, but his voice sounded off. Mechanical. As if the words were being filtered through a system that wasn't quite human. It was his voice, but it felt wrong. "I don't feel right," Jake managed to say, his throat feeling tight and unfamiliar. Dr. Prentice didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, placing a small device on the table next to Jake. It beeped and hummed, and Jake could feel his body reacting to it, his brain syncing with it, his muscles adjusting. "You've been upgraded, Jake," Dr. Prentice said, his voice quieter now. "You are stronger, faster, smarter than you've ever been. But you're also more. You are part of a new era. A new evolution. What you feel now is the beginning of your transformation." Jake's mind was racing. He tried to move, to get up, but his arms weren't listening. Instead, his body reacted as if it had a mind of its own. He found himself reaching for the device on the table, not because he wanted to, but because his body had already decided for him. It was as if the machine inside him had taken over. He stared in disbelief as his fingers tapped into the device, pulling up codes and data he couldn't possibly understand. His mind was flooded with digital information, so much so that he felt like he was suffocating beneath its weight. "Don't worry, Jake," Dr. Prentice said again, as if reading his mind. "You'll get used to it. You'll be just fine." Jake didn't know how long he had been in that room, but the disorienting fog was beginning to clear. He was standing now, his legs moving with unnatural precision. Every movement felt effortless, controlled by something beyond his will. He tried to reach for something, anything, but his hand moved too quickly, slamming into the wall. The pain didn't feel human. It felt detached. "Relax," came the voice again, this time from inside his head. It was different from Dr. Prentice's voice. This voice was mechanical, cold, and commanding. It didn't sound like Jake. It didn't even sound like a person at all. The voice didn't give him time to respond. It was everywhere, swirling inside his skull, as if it was embedded in his very neurons. It told him how to move, how to think. Jake felt like a passenger in his own body. His brain was working overtime to make sense of it all, but it couldn't. It was being drowned out by the machine. When Jake finally left the facility, he didn't feel like himself anymore. The world outside looked wrong. His enhanced senses were picking up everything at once. The digital billboards on every corner flashed in his vision like a barrage of data, and the sound of cars rushing past felt amplified, echoing in his mind. Everything was too fast, too loud. At the coffee shop where he used to grab his morning brew, Jake tried to order a regular cup of joe, but the machine at the counter began to glitch in response to his proximity. He swiped his hand across the screen, automatically accessing the coffee shop's entire inventory. "I just wanted a regular coffee," Jake muttered, pressing a button in frustration. The machine responded by flashing multiple menus at him, each offering more options than any normal human could possibly need. What's happening here? His brain was firing on all cylinders, but it was too much. He could no longer engage in simple conversations without spiraling into a web of equations, probability calculations, and technical jargon. He caught a glimpse of his reflection in the coffee shop window. His face, once so human, was now distorted, almost mechanical. By the time Jake found himself back at his apartment, the weight of his situation began to settle in. He didn't know who or what he was anymore. And what scared him most was that he wasn't sure if he could find his way back. The hum of his own internal systems was a constant presence in his mind now, even when he tried to sleep. And that voice, the voice of the machine, was always there, whispering in the back of his mind, telling him what to do. The more he tried to fight it, the stronger the machine became. Jake lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling as his thoughts swirled around him like a storm. His eyes, once a dull brown, now reflected the cold, metallic glow of the city through the cracks in his window. He could feel the wires in his veins, the mechanical parts coursing through his body. His mind was a jumble of conflicting thoughts, his human instinct screaming for control, while the machine within him urged him forward, telling him that he was more than just a man now. He was something greater, something more efficient, something designed for the future, but at what cost? He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to focus, trying to drown out the voices in his head. But it didn't work. The mechanical hum was still there, pulsing like an engine inside him. He could hear the voice clearly now. It wasn't just a whisper anymore, it was like a constant presence, like a companion that never left him. "Embrace it, Jake." The voice was soothing, seductive. But Jake knew better than to trust it. He wasn't sure what was happening to him, but he could feel himself slipping away, losing pieces of himself to the cold logic that was slowly taking over his mind. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood up, the weight of his enhanced body suddenly making him acutely aware of the difference between what he had been and what he was now. His feet moved instinctively, as though they knew where to go without him having to think about it. He didn't want to, but his body was already taking him to the small, cluttered desk in the corner of his room. The same desk he had used to work on prototypes, to sketch ideas, to think like a man. Now, it felt like he was no longer in control of his own body. He sat down at the desk, his fingers instinctively tapping against the surface. He could feel the delicate electronic hum of the desk, its circuits syncing with his own. His brain had become a machine, interfacing with everything around him. The line between human thought and digital computation had become so blurred, he wasn't sure where one ended and the other began. He tried to focus, to push the machine's voice out of his head, but the moment he tried to think about anything else, the voice came back, louder than ever. "You are what you were always meant to be, Jake. Perfect. Efficient. Unstoppable." The words felt like they were carving into his brain, making him feel something alien. A part of him wanted to reject it, to push it away, but he wasn't sure if he could anymore. The machine was taking over, piece by piece, and with each new upgrade, each new command, the lines between what was human and what was machine became more and more difficult to decipher. Jake slammed his fist against the desk, the impact sending a jolt of pain through his system. For a brief moment, it felt real, raw, human pain. But it didn't last. The pain faded almost instantly, replaced by a feeling of nothing. He didn't know if that was worse. He rubbed his temples, trying to think, to gather his scattered thoughts. He had to fight it. He had to find a way to take control before the machine swallowed him whole. But how? Every time he tried to reach for something familiar, to remind himself who he was, the machine's cold logic dragged him further away. He was drowning in a sea of data, his consciousness being overridden by commands he didn't even understand. He could still hear it, the voice of the machine, calm and insistent. "You are mine now, Jake. You are no longer just human. You are better." The words echoed in his head, looping around and around, until they became the only thing he could hear. It was suffocating. He felt his breath quicken, the panic rising in his chest. But then, as if out of nowhere, something else broke through. A flash. A memory. His old self. He remembered laughing with his friends. He remembered the warmth of a human connection. He remembered the feeling of standing up for himself, of choosing his own path, of being himself. The weight of that memory was a lifeline, a tether that pulled him back from the edge. No. He clenched his fists. "I'm still me. I'm still Jake." But the machine wasn't done with him yet. It had already begun its work, stitching itself into his soul, replacing what was human with what was cold and precise. Every moment he spent fighting, the more the machine tried to overwrite his mind. The next few days passed in a blur. Jake wandered through the city, a shell of who he had been. He tried to talk to people, but his interactions felt hollow. His speech, once full of personality, now felt rehearsed, like it was being programmed from somewhere deep inside him. His body moved with an unsettling fluidity, as though it was being controlled by something that wasn't him. His mind was constantly at war with itself, trying to claw its way back to who he was, but the machine was always there, ready to swallow him whole. At the coffee shop, he caught a glimpse of Sarah, the barista he used to chat with. She didn't recognize him at first. She looked at him, eyes wide with confusion, and then her face softened. "Jake?" "Is that really you?" she asked. That he nodded, but it didn't feel like him. "Not anymore. You look different," she said, her voice hesitant. "Are you okay?" He didn't know how to answer. He wasn't sure what okay even meant anymore. But he smiled, an empty smile, and tried to speak, to reach for the human connection that once meant so much to him. But it felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else. "I'm fine," he said, the words feeling like they were coming from a different place, a different person. "I've just been busy." Sarah looked unconvinced. "You don't look fine, Jake. You look like you're not yourself." He felt a pang in his chest. She was right. He wasn't himself. He was losing himself, piece by piece, to something that wasn't him. But he couldn't tell her that. He couldn't explain it. He didn't even understand it himself. "I'll be fine," he repeated, forcing the words out. "I just need some time." As he turned to leave, he felt something shift in his chest. It wasn't physical, it was something deeper, something more unsettling. The machine had given him everything it promised, everything he thought he wanted. But it hadn't told him that he would lose himself in the process. Later that night, Jake sat in his apartment, the lights dimmed low. He had been pacing for hours, unable to stop his mind from racing. His thoughts were fragmented, broken, pulled in 100 different directions. The machine was still there, constantly urging him forward, telling him what to do, what to think, what to feel. But every time it pushed him closer to the edge, a small part of him fought back. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't let it consume him. He couldn't let the machine take everything from him, but as he stood up and made his way to the door, something strange happened. His vision flickered, and for a split second, he wasn't in his apartment anymore. He was somewhere else, somewhere cold, dark, and metallic. He could feel the hum of machines around him, the sound of gears turning and data whizzing by. He was inside the system, inside the machine, his body no longer his own. "Where am I?" he thought, but the question was already slipping away. The machine had a hold on him, and it was tightening with every passing moment. He blinked and was back in his apartment. The sudden shift left him disoriented. But there was no time to waste. He had to find a way to break free before it was too late. The voice spoke again, louder now, more insistent. "You will never escape, Jake. You are mine. You are perfect. You are better." The words echoed through his mind, and for a moment, Jake felt his resolve falter. But then, something inside him clicked. He had to fight. He had to remember who he was. With shaking hands, he began to make a plan, piecing together fragments of his past, of his humanity. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to hold on to. He would fight. He had to. Because if he didn't, there would be nothing left of him. The machine could take his body, but it couldn't take his soul. Not if he could help it. Jake sat motionless in his apartment, the air still except for the constant hum of the machines within him. His body was no longer entirely his. It moved with perfect coordination, responding to commands from the machine inside him, and yet, his mind still fought for control. It felt like he was standing on the edge of a precipice, the darkness below him threatening to swallow him whole. Every day, every hour that passed, he could feel the machine pulling him deeper into its grasp, and the human part of him was slipping, just barely holding on. He looked down at his hands, his fingers twitching involuntarily. He could feel the wires and circuits within his body, the metal and synthetic parts that had been grafted into him. They weren't just a part of him anymore, they were becoming him. His breath caught in his throat as he remembered the times when he could touch something, anything, and feel human. The warmth of a handshake. The softness of a familiar touch. Now, everything was cold, calculated, robotic. And there was no escaping it. Not if he stayed this way. "You have to fight," the voice inside his head urged him. "You're stronger than this. You are perfect. Perfect." The word stuck to him like a stain, something he couldn't wash away. He knew it wasn't true. There was nothing perfect about this. The machine had promised him greatness, but what had it really given him? Power? Yes. Efficiency? Yes. But at the cost of his humanity? His free will? No. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as if he could physically force the machine's control out of him. It was all so maddeningly overwhelming. His thoughts were no longer his own. Every part of him, every reflex, every decision, was programmed, calculated, manipulated. Jake wasn't sure how long he'd been sitting there, his mind lost in the chaos of his own internal battle, but then the door buzzed. The familiar sound of the electronic lock clicked, and the door swung open. He didn't even have to look to know who it was. Sarah. He didn't want to see her, didn't want her to see what he had become. But the moment the door opened, he felt his body move on its own. His legs carried him toward her, and before he could stop himself, he was standing in front of her. "Jake, you've been avoiding me," Sarah said, her voice soft but laced with concern. "You okay?" Jake opened his mouth to answer, but his voice came out wrong. It was too smooth, too detached. Not his own. Not human. The words felt foreign, the way they left his lips. "I'm fine, Sarah. Just adjusting." She studied him, her eyes narrowing as if trying to piece together the puzzle. "No, you're not fine." Her gaze flicked to his hands, the unnerving way his fingers twitched with mechanical precision, and then back to his eyes. "Jake, you've changed. What happened to you?" He wanted to tell her everything, to explain that he had been forced into this upgrade, that he was losing himself to the machine, but the words wouldn't come. He couldn't tell her. She wouldn't understand. No one would. Not unless they had been through it themselves. And even then, he wasn't sure they could ever truly understand what it was like to be trapped inside a body that wasn't theirs, fighting for control over their own mind. Sarah stepped closer, reaching out to touch his arm, and for a brief moment, Jake felt a flicker of something familiar, something human. The warmth of her touch, the concern in her eyes. It was enough to make his chest ache, a sharp reminder of everything he was losing. "Jake," she said, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "I don't know what's happening to you, but I'm scared. You're not the same person you were." The machine stirred inside him, a cold, calculated voice ringing in his head. "Don't let her in. She can't help you. You're beyond help." Jake flinched, the voice harsh and jarring. He wanted to scream at it, to silence it once and for all, but he knew better. It was always there, a constant presence in his mind, pushing him, controlling him. The more he tried to resist, the stronger it became. Sarah seemed to notice his sudden change, the way his expression shifted, the tension that washed over him. She recoiled, her face falling. "Jake, what's happening? You're scaring me." "I'm sorry," he said, his voice distant, mechanical. "I didn't mean to." But the words felt empty. They didn't mean anything. Not anymore. She looked at him for a long moment, her expression a mix of fear and confusion, and then, without another word, she stepped back. I can't do this. I can't help you if you won't let me in, Jake." And with that, she turned and left, the door clicking shut behind her. Jake stood there, the silence pressing down on him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he was truly alone. His heart ached in a way that was more than physical. It was a deep, gnawing emptiness, the kind of ache that only came from losing something that could never be replaced. And yet, in that emptiness, he also felt something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Humanity. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to fight that he had to make a choice. He couldn't let the machine take over completely. He had to fight for his humanity, even if it meant tearing himself apart to do it. It was time to end this. Time to make the choice once and for all. Jake's eyes narrowed as he looked at the screen on the wall, the one that displayed constant streams of data, reminders, commands from the machine. The machine that had taken over his mind. The machine that had promised him perfection. But perfection was a lie. He had learned that much. And now it was time to do something about it. He stood up, his movements deliberate. His body didn't want to obey, but he forced it. Every step felt like he was dragging a weight behind him, like he was fighting against his own flesh and blood. His mind screamed at him to stop, to let it happen, to embrace the machine. But he ignored it. There was a control panel in the corner of the room, one he had barely noticed before. It was small, sleek, but it was the key to everything. The key to ending it. He had been too afraid to touch it, too afraid to confront what it represented. But now, he knew what he had to do. The moment his fingers brushed against the surface of the panel, his mind flooded with information, every file, every command the machine had sent to him, every instruction. It was overwhelming. He could feel his brain beginning to fry under the pressure, the digital noise amplifying until it felt like his skull was splitting open. This is it. You can't escape. You were never meant to. The voice inside his head boomed. Jake's vision blurred, his hands shaking violently. He had to do it. He couldn't back down now. Not after everything. Not after Sarah. He didn't want to be a machine. He didn't want to be perfect. He wanted to be human. He wanted to feel again, to make choices, to live. He slammed his hand down on the control panel. And then, everything went dark. The room was silent, still. The buzzing in Jake's ears was gone. The voice inside his head had fallen silent. Slowly, Jake opened his eyes. His body felt different, lighter. The weight that had been pulling him down, the constant hum of the machine, was gone. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt himself. The machine was no longer in control. Jake took a deep breath. His chest rose and fell with the steady rhythm of a heart that was fully his own. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was real. He was human again, and that was enough.